Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in this morning to this month's Farm Yarns. We have a very special guest joining us today, Matt Perkis, the Managing Director for Project Biome South Africa. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, put together a brief presentation to guide us through the conversation today. Well, for context, the idea to make this month's topic regeneration across the globe really came from internal conversations and realizing that the understanding that we have about regenerative agriculture in a US context can be very different to the global understanding of regeneration in the context of agroecology. And when we started diving a little deeper into this conversation as an internal team at Farmers Footprint, and then with a larger team at Project Biome. Project Biome is our sister organization, and yeah, I mean, we thought who better than Matt to bring forward this perspective. So Matt, if I'll pass over the mic to you if you want to share a little bit about your background, Project Biome, and then we can jump right in.
Thanks, Alana. Great to be here with everyone today, and good morning to our colleagues in America and those internationally. My name is Matthew Perkis. Regional Director for Project Biome. And my background is actually in ecological design, which was a unique crossover between my design background and then I found permaculture, and permaculture has opened up a whole new world, really looking at how you apply that design lens at scale. And then kind of evolved into this food system transformation space in South Africa, which we've been, working quite hard at over the last 15 years. And it feels like things are really maturing. And looking forward to sharing some of the insights today and a little bit about Project Biome. So, as Alana has mentioned, we're one of the sister organizations in the ecosystem, working quite closely with Farmers Footprint. And Project Biome is really getting stuck into the work in South Africa as our pilot country. And we are working in partnership with various lead organizations here with a focus on regeneration, rewilding, and reconnecting. Those are our three main R's that we are focused on, but that takes us quite broad into, food system transformation, which is the topic of the day, and then of course into ecosystem restoration and of course the social dynamics. Humans are pivotal in this work, so that's very broadly what we do. Looking forward to the conversation, Lana. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Matt. So before we dive right in, it's a little bit of context, and as many of you are probably already aware, it's not uncommon to understand regenerative agriculture as a set of specific practices that can be, or some of those can include rotational grazing and carbon sequestration, etc. So to begin the conversation, the first question that I wanna prompt us and Matt to delve deeper is, what can the regenerative agriculture movement learn from agroecology regarding context-based agriculture, social equity, and moving from a technical approach to a principles-based one?
It's a rich question, Alana, and one that is being discussed at a global level. Attending the Organic World Congress in Taiwan earlier this year, this marry between the regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, and agroecology, and the various nuances between the three. But ultimately, we're all part of the same family, and we are working towards that same common objective. where we are cleaning up our food systems. We're making people very aware of the health risks of contaminated foods with pesticides and herbicides. You know, there's a big debate at the moment around genetic modification and whether that's actually, you know, appropriate for human consumption, even animal consumption. So it's a rich debate. And I think specifically the difference with agroecology and regen ag is that within the agroecology movement, there's a very strong social component to it. You know, that social justice, really addressing the power imbalances in the food system, and really making sure that the human-centered approach and putting farmers' rights is really at the top of the agenda in agroecology, where regen ag is a little bit more practice-based. So looking at how we can improve our farming practices, but often sometimes does slightly overlook the social components and the social dynamics around food system transformation. So I would say those are the two main pivot points between the differences, but there are definitely more commonalities that we need to focus on. And I think that's the common message that is going out globally, is that there's so much more to focus on, that we can work together, have a shared vision, and overlook some of the practice differences.
Mm, mm. Yeah, thank you for highlighting the importance of the commonalities as well. And could you talk a little bit more about some of those commonalities and how they might be expressed differently from context to context?
Sure. So some of the practice commonalities, really, when you look down to it, so the soil regeneration component of it, minimizing the use of synthetics in your farming practices, especially for, you know, the ranchers that are doing regenerative grazing, sequestering carbon through, you know, upgrading the organic soil carbon, um, and then biodiversity restoration. So things like cover cropping, introducing important fauna and flora back on the farms. There's certainly many crossovers when it comes down to practice. And I think the one other thing is that the regenerative value chain is a farmer-centered one. And it allows us to put farmers first, you know, where I think the corporate food system as we know it is a rather extractive value chain and doesn't often put the farmer first, puts the farmer last. And that's where you see these massive differences between what the farmer gets versus what's being sold in retail, and trying to close that gap a little bit. So enabling environments, policy frameworks, incentivized programs for farmers making the shift. There's a lot to be unpacked there.
Mm, mm. And what about the context-based agriculture? Like in I mean, and agroecology is a fairly new term for me, although like once I became a little more familiar with it, as you said, realizing that there's a lot of shared commonalities with the regenerative agriculture movement. Um, but the way that I think the thing that most stood out to me in the commonalities around principles is that the practices that might end up being applied from place to place can also be very different. When we think about, let's say, like the regenerative agriculture in the plains, as opposed to regenerative agriculture or agroforestry in a different ecosystem and environment. Um, and some I'm curious if, in your experience, you've seen some of the potential risks of not considering the context-based approach when applying a certain set of practices.
Yeah, that's a really meaty point. And I think that's where looking at all of these tools that we have, so regenerative grazing, agroforestry, silvopasture, permaculture, organic agriculture, organic regen, you know, they're basically all tools in the toolbox. And whenever you get to using a tool, you've got to make sure you pick up the right tool for the job. And when you try and use the same tool for different jobs, you're not going to get it right. So it's really about selecting the right type of thinking that is matched with context. So in the context of large-scale grasslands. You're not going to go and put down an agroforestry system if the climate is not going to enjoy it, and those productive trees are not necessarily fitted to that bioregion. So it's really using the right tools at the right times. And I think having a design lens on that, it really assists us in selecting the right methodology or practice for the context.
Mm, Thank you. Thank you. And for our next question, and this feels like a beautiful segue into that context-specific approach, who is more likely to truly know the context of a place, if not the people who have been there the longest? So in what ways can regenerative agriculture initiatives move beyond just borrowing Indigenous practices and towards supporting Indigenous leadership and worldview in farming?
Yeah, it's a key question. This rise of Indigenous knowledge and really paying homage to context, the people of the land and the land itself. I think that is really one of the core pillars that we are looking to bring the culture back into agriculture, where we have evolved at now. We're kind of in the space of agribusiness, and we've almost lost that culture, right? So culture is place-based. It's located in the bioregional countries, language, consumption patterns, various crops which are indigenous, grains that are indigenous to the people, and really honoring, some of these indigenous grains that have been lost. It's just been replaced by maize, which isn't necessarily endemic to the region of consumption. So really looking at that indigeneity around food, um, culture that it's linked to as well. But then the indigenous leadership within that, and really bolstering that ability to support, because the indigenous leadership can mobilize masses of community, but to ensure that the technical skill sets are there to assist in either going a little bit more back to indigenous practices or looking at a combination of regenerative practice and indigenous knowledge. And like you said, it is really context specific, but making sure we don't lose that element of culture with this industrialized food system that we have so come used to, as consumers, global consumers. We can get varieties of food on our plate now from different parts of the world that we weren't able to get even 30 years ago. So in which way are we evolving? And I think a bit more of a radical localization approach, honoring indigenous cultures and the foods that we've eaten endemically, is probably the solution for the end of, yep.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it even, I mean, the choice of words for the slide in borrowing Indigenous practices is quite gentle in essence, but when we think about it, really, the risks of extracting Indigenous practices without incorporating the social and cultural elements of it feels like yet another form of colonization almost, or extraction, if we just borrow the technicalities of it without really incorporating the Indigenous worldview and societies as a core part of this movement towards regionalized food systems. Which leads me to my next question. I think the first time you shared with me some of the principles of agroecology, it just seemed to provide a really clear structure and framework that allows for that regionalization of it as well. I'll pass it over to you.
Can you see my screen on the principles?
Hmm, let me stop sharing my screen. Maybe that's why I can't see it.
Principles are up, I'm assuming. So agroecology has 13 main principles that it operates around. And I think this is where, when you look at the guiding principles of a framework, This is why it's gained a lot of traction globally, because it really does touch on so many different components of the food system, right? From recycling, that's really making sure that we understand there is no throw away. There's always going to go to landfill. So how are we maximizing circular economies around recycling? Input production is a really key component of it. So when you start to look at reduction of NPK and the scaled use of herbicides and pesticides, like how can we reduce those inputs? It's not to say it's going to be purely organic, organic, but we're on the path as a farmer. We're on the journey to reduce those inputs. Prioritizing soil health, really looking at the subsoil, the things like microbes and mycelia, that without those in the soil, you don't have that balance. So really looking to subsidize the important things instead of synthetics, rather get the microbes and mycelia back in the soil and sink your carbon. You really are improving the general soil health. Cover cropping is another skill there. Animal health, you can't really separate animal husbandry from these types of integrated food systems. When you look at the beef industry and the large scale feedlots, and we know that ethically there's a lot of questions around that. Consumers around the planet are questioning feedlots. Yes, it is an economically viable way to rear cattle, but is it ethical? So really, you can't separate the ethics around how we treat our animals on the farm from soil. For me, they go hand in hand. If you've got a circular fertility system on your farm with animals, you're automatically boosting your soil health. Biodiversity is a key element there. Really looking at how we can bolster biodiversity on farm, bring back indigenous trees. And often when I get out to these areas that farm large scale grains, there's not a tree to be seen at all. It's kind of remove the trees as their obstacles. But ultimately, if you remove the trees, you remove the rain. So really looking at biodiversity and bringing back that on farm. Economic diversification. What is more resilient? A monoculture, 10,000 acre farm producing one crop, or a smaller farm with multiple crops on there, which mitigates the farmer risk, also opens up economic opportunities through agro processing. So it's really about diversifying the farm model. And of course, that translates into the economics. The social values and the diets, as we were talking about now, what people are used to be eating as indigenous cultures, how those foods have been very central in the culture component of agriculture. And you cannot decouple social equality from agriculture. And we see this extractive food system is perpetuating this really big economic gap between farm owners and farm workers. And we're seeing that there's a definite need for equality in that regard. Fairness, an all-round principle. I think this is one of the key things. Like, is the food system fair? Are the farmers being treated fairly from a price point perspective? Who's taking the majority of profits in the value chain? Is it retail? Is it the aggregators? Is it the middlemen? And often it's the retail taking the lion's share. So where does that leave the farmer at the end of the day? Is it a fair, just food system? And I think that's really where agroecology has some really strong components to it. Co-creation of knowledge, which is a really profound thing. And I've seen that active here in South Africa, where you get peer-to-peer farmer groups visiting each other. And over a course of 2 years, like a farmer that's just started farming out agroecology, organic, regen, and where they are after 2 years of participating in their peer-to-peer group, they're a different farmer. They understand what best practices and where to go, how to manage pests, how to integrate farms onto animals on farms. So that information sharing between farmers is really one of the most powerful components of this. And then ultimately, land and natural resource governance. So that's also linked to the social equality. There's toolkits like integrated landscape management when you're looking at watersheds and how to get multiple communities to collaborate around a watershed to start looking at the health of the rivers, the soil, the grasslands, forests. So having a little bit more of an integrated landscape approach allows us to look at watersheds, health of rivers, and ecosystems at large. And another one really big piece of this is participation in the food system. How do you get consumers and farmers to participate together? How do you bridge the gaps between this disconnect that we've had as consumers around the planet, where we are no longer connected to the way our food is produced? And is that not the reason for the culture being in agriculture? Because it's an act of humanity. It's one of our founding things as a human species was to farm and produce our own food and be connected to that process and not industrialize it. So I think in many ways, when you look at these principles of agroecology, how they can be applied broad across a broad spectrum, we see that this can really facilitate a shift and a transition to more local food systems. And I just want to draw the attention on the left-hand side there. It even starts to map out the various levels of food system transformation. So at level one, you've got increase of efficiency of input use and reduce of costly and scarce damaging inputs. So that's like overuse of synthetics, basically. And I would say a lot of the first world, the global north, is still in that level 1 and 2, where we're trying to figure out this transition away. I think where global south is naturally a little bit more advanced is that in some cases we haven't had that really aggressive push by agribusiness. But in some cases we have. In South Africa, particularly where I live, we've had a really strong push by agribusiness over the past 20 years. And we can see what that's tangibly done to the food system and people's health. So just going through that level 1, 2, 3, 4, and then ultimately 5, where we're building a new global food system based on participation, local, and fairness and justice. I think that's quite the unique part about how we can start to map out our transition as we move to a more sustainable, ethical food system.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for walking us through that. I know you mentioned on the levels of transformation this concept of the global north and the global south. Um, could you delve deeper a little bit about that notion?
Mm. Yeah, it's a big one to unpack, Alana. So I mean, a lot of the more modern, should we call it that, production styles have stemmed from the global north, and we see how the dominance of certain agribusiness has now even gone into various different continents. How certain philanthropic endeavors have shaped government programs in the global south. So there's this innate connection between technologies, funding mechanisms in the global north and the impact on the developing world. And when we say global south, we're talking of South America, Africa, India, Asia, Australia, and many of those pockets, if you like, are deemed developing. So we're not as first world, if you like, we call third world countries in many of the international frameworks, but we cannot decouple this relationship that the influence on the global north and the global south is there. And we need to like really understand that from funding mechanisms to programs to how agribusiness can lobby policy. And as we know in America, that's a very alive topic. As we see, corporates influence on governments, and I think it's a global phenomenon. And I think there's many countries pushing back and really going back into that sovereign state mentality where we want to produce, agro process, value add, and then sell instead of just exporting our raw product to the global north. As Africa, why aren't we doing our own agro processing and value addition? I mean, that's a basic question. And I think it's the aftermath of this, I suppose, global north influence on how it's been going here in the global south.
Thank you. Yeah, it definitely a big one to unpack. And yeah, it's I guess the main reason why I asked is because yeah, it's my understanding that it's less of a demographic distinction and more of a like industrialization. Typically we refer to the global south for countries or regions who have historically been extracted from, colonized. And I think in the context of these conversations and seeing like some of the agroecology principles and regenerative agricultural practices, it's very relevant to ask ourselves, like when we think of the developing world, what are we developing towards? And I think for a lot of the quote unquote global south regions, there's in a lot of ways, and especially seeing these incremental levels of transformation in the food system, some countries or regions that we might typically think are less developed are actually higher up in these levels of transformation, because they haven't yet been so industrialized and removed from this like close relationship with their ecosystems and more regionalized food systems as well. So yeah, I think that's one of the exchanges that excites me the most about our collaboration between Farmers Footprint and Project Biome, and knowing that Farmers Footprint was an organization that came out of the United States and started to engage with a primarily US, Australia, UK audience in that invitation that the global north in this moment in time has actually a lot to learn from the global south, and how they I mean, not, and I don't mean to say that us versus them approach, but how the global south as a region, or some of the practices that are still more alive in these contexts, are actually a lot more resilient sometimes, when we compare them to a very industrialized food system where the consumer is very far removed from the source of how the food is being produced. And I mean, just looking over a lot of the principles that you shared in contexts where we might think as more developed, are actually a lot further away in this context in particular.
Totally. And I think one of the global phenomenons that we're witnessing at the moment, and it rings true in Europe, in America, in the global south, is bring back the smaller farm. And these smaller family farms, which already have been, pivotal in our food sovereignty as countries globally. The smaller the farm, the more local, the more manageable, frankly. I mean, these farms that are 5,000 acres growing one crop is not necessarily the future, as we can see how damaging that is to the ecosystem, biodiversity, soil health, people's health, river health. Do we need massive farms like that? I think is the big question. And from when my finger's on the pulse in Europe, it's the same thing. It's like bring back the smaller farm, because that's really where the heart of it lies, and that's also the economic power of having numbers, power in numbers. And that's really the thing about looking at agriculture going forward over the next 100 years. It's like, this is probably one of our biggest design challenges as the human species, is how do we make our local food systems robust, ethical, regenerative, and have the farmer first, and I think that's just a complete pivot to where we're heading and where we have been since, frankly, World War II, where we had that um, overproduction of chemicals, and we didn't quite know what to do with them. So we just made them agricultural inputs, frankly, if I can call a spade a spade. But yeah, I think that's where this whole industrialized food system has emanated from. And, since the 1940s, and it's now 2025, we can see the impact that it's had on our food system and our human health, our gut health, our soil health. So it's really going back to basics as far as I can see, Alana.
Mm, mm. Yeah, what a what a great way to sum it up. Let's just go back to the basics of what it means to be human, and we might just be all right. Um, I'll yeah, if I can share my screen again, and then we can just pick up the presentation and keep moving through some of the questions that I have for you. Yeah, super interesting though. Thank you. Thank you for sharing the principles of agroecology with us and really expanding that view on some of the aspects that is really important are at the core of any any movement that aims to regenerate our food system. Um, so yeah, our next question here, and just to share a little bit of context, I mean, in a very industrialized food system, we tend to measure efficiency, right, as a measure of success, and calories. Like, how efficiently can we grow calories? And in the more traditional sense of regenerative agriculture, we can look at things such as carbon sequestration, um, or diversity of crops, and soil health is another like pretty common measure for regenerative agriculture. And for this question, I'd like to ask for your perspective, Matt, about how could we measure success beyond yield, and really to include some of the principles that you touched on, such as social cohesion, nutrition, and empowerment. And what are some of the indicators that we can see when these principles are applied on the ground?
Yeah, I think this is a really great, deep question. These metrics, which are sometimes elusive when you're really looking into how do you get social and economic impact as well as environment, harmonized in a set of metrics that allow us to measure effectively. But indeed, social cohesion, how in our context here, most of the farmers in Africa are women. And are they included in the value chain? And really looking at social inclusion, how do we get participation happening at a local level? Getting more consumers involved, getting the smaller independent retailers involved and invested in, participating as well as investing into this transformation of the food system. And retail have a really key thing to play, a role to play within that. I know Dan Kittredge has done some incredible work around nutrition and how to measure that. We've got these technologies which are coming out now where you can literally scan the leaf of a vegetable and you can get the nutritional profile on it. And, when you start looking at feeding schemes, which is very popular in the global south, where you've got the majority tercile of people not necessarily having enough income to provide for their families. So the children often get fed at school. But now are the school feeding schemes procuring nutritious produce, right? And that's one of the big questions that are relevant here in South Africa is to try and avoid this child stunting phenomenon that we've seen since, frankly, we've introduced genetically modified maize as one of the staple foods for children in feeding schemes. And we can see this lack of nutrients, but overconsumption of carbohydrates, which is leading to a bloating population. So it's really interesting when you start looking at the nutritional value of food. I think that's a really powerful indicator we can look at. And empowerment, like how do we get youth inspired about agriculture? I think it's a global stat where the average age of a farmer is over 58. And there's very little youth coming through into agriculture because, yes, it is hard work, it's time in the sun, but you work for yourself, and you're actually the master of your own destiny. You're not stuck behind a laptop in an office cubicle working for the man. So there's so many different components about it. And it's really like, what is important to us? I think I would like to reflect back to the group is like, how do we feel measuring these indicators around success would translate into the various continents? And I think it is a contextually specific question, but a very meaty one. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you, Matt. Yeah. Yeah, I love when you touch on like how do we feel about measuring these things, and that reminder to not let ourselves limit what we measure just because it can be measured. And we can squeeze it in to some like very specific number, which is we want to do that. We want to do that sometimes to make it real, it seems like. But that reminder that there are things that are very, very important that maybe we're not able to measure with the current set of tools we have, but it's essential that we keep acknowledging the importance of them, and seeing them as success too. And some of these things might take many years. And I think that patience also, and continuing to be on that path can be challenging for a lot of farmers or people who are looking to transition into a different way of being in relationship with their land. Um, yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
No, I think we've touched on this in your previous answers, but just to really drive it home, how can regenerative initiatives make sure that improvements in soil health also translate to improvements in farmer livelihoods and community empowerment?
Yeah, I think that's really where the consumers come into it. Like I think, consumers drive demand. It's that old adage, which is so true. So if the consumers aren't asking enough questions of retail about localizing or local sourcing, the various certifications thereof, food safety issues, overuse of pesticides and herbicides, food testing, food safety, the consumers really hold this in their hands. Because if we are not challenging industry to shift the way that we produce food globally, we're going to be stuck in this extractive value chain where, industry is getting away with a lot, and there's very little accountability within the agricultural value chain, especially when you look to the export markets and how food moves around the planet. Often you get crazy examples like pears are grown in Argentina, flown over to Europe to get agro processed, and flown back to South America to get resold in that same retail market. So it's just like mental what actually happens when you start analyzing these supply chains and how they go around the planet. And I suppose that's this rapid growth of globalization that we've witnessed in our generation. But there's definitely a counter movement where consumers are really starting, especially the Gen X and Gen Z generation, are really starting to lean in about where it was produced, how it was produced, what the ethical pricing is behind it. Asking the questions, which is the most important thing. Um, but yeah, farmer livelihoods, that is the most important thing, because we have to be able to make regenerative, organic, agroecological production profitable, because it is nothing worse for me when you hear about an organic farmer getting stuck in a retail value chain and he gets the same price as a conventional farmer who's doing lazy farming, in my view, and not getting the appropriate price, right? So how do we restructure value chains where equitability and common sense is actually at the forefront of it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that reminder. Is like if if you eat, you're a stakeholder in the food system, and you can, yeah, I mean, whether it's conscious or unconscious, we are supporting one thing or another each day, multiple times a day. I'm gonna, yeah, I'm gonna move a little quicker through these so that we can have a little time for Q&A, because this is such a meaty conversation. I'd like to open it up in a little bit for anyone who has questions. So yeah, for the case studies, I mean, I'm almost feeling like maybe we should keep moving through the questions, because there's some really there's some really meaty ones. Okay, so I'm just gonna glance through these and maybe we can incorporate them into some of the answers moving forward. But yeah, maybe that you can speak to this more in the context of South Africa, if we wanted to bring in that specific case study. But how would you say urban consumers can be reconnected with their bioregional food system? And how might that change their diets or expectations?
I think that's probably the crux of it, Alana. You know, how do we get consumers, no matter where you live, to be plugged into your local regional food system? First one is storytelling. I feel really getting that narrative out there, making consumers aware that they actually carry that voting power in their pocket, and asking these tough questions of retailers. Show us the certification. Um, why is the price point different for conventional? Why is the food system subsidized on a conventional level, but the true cost of organic is perceived to be expensive? Um, in South Africa, we've had quite some success of bringing farmers and consumers together on the farm visits themselves. And we're predominantly doing that through a system called the participatory guarantee system, which is a bit more peer-to-peer. It is a certification system, second party, but the participation of that system allows for one, knowledge exchange, transparency, trust to evolve, really getting that consumer and farmer to trust each other again after all of these false claims that we've been witnessing over the past, 4 decades plus. The trust has left. So I think really bringing the trust element back into it, and it really catalyzes so much when consumers are actually walking the farm, seeing how the farmer, listening to the farmer's passion. That often just changes the dial immediately. So trying to facilitate a little bit more of those engagements on farm. And then we've also had a really successful pilot here, which is scaled out around the country, called food clubs. So it's basically a whole bunch of consumers that get together and they say, we would like to source local dairy, cheese, breads, artisanal foods, agro-processed goods, fresh vegetables. And they come together as a buying club. And, then the farmers support these and sell directly to these buying clubs. It's similar to a CSA, community supported agriculture. So those types of systems, which are decentralized in nature, I think have a huge massive role to play in how we see the evolution of the food system unfolding from here.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I really love how you emphasize the importance of rebuilding trust in our system. Um, I think there's so many ways that we can try to approach it. As someone such as myself who is not a farmer, I don't currently grow my own food. Hopefully, one day I'll grow at least part of it. Um, but yeah, in that, we can look at certifications, we can shop more locally, but it really, when we keep peeling layers off of it, it really does come back to restoring that relationship with the farmer, with the person that is growing our food, and so many times that process happens through curiosity and conversation, and acknowledging that there are people who wake up every day to grow our food so that we can eat. And I think when we, it's, I mean, I'm not going to go on a tangent, but it reminds me of yeah, this like Robinson Crusoe line when he's left stuck in an island with all this gold, and he can't eat it. So it's that, like, yeah, just that reminder of what are we valuing, and why do we eat, and how can we come together as a community to support what truly matters and to support the people who are growing it, and supporting that with our everyday choices too. And those are some incredible examples of ways that communities are organizing around these values in places like South Africa. We see it here in Mexico too. it looks very different in the US. Again, that context-based approach, right? Well, we're all going to organize around what we can do and how we can rebuild that trust in our food system in a different way, depending on where we are, whether that's through a certification like the regenerative organic certification, fair trade, organic, going directly and sparking conversation with a farmer, or growing food
Mm.
yourself in a community garden. There are many ways to do it. And this question is one of my personal favorites too. And I know that there's also no singular answer, but I am really curious to know your perspective on it. Um, is there a place for global trade in a mostly localized, regionalized food system?
Yeah, that's a big one. Um, in this massive expansion of population that we've seen on the planet, I think there's always going to be a need for global trade, as far as I can see. But re like rearranging the supply chain so we don't have that silly example of pears being grown in Argentina, flown over to Europe, and then flown back, where those types of supply chains are just completely carbon heavy, then make no logical sense. It's just around cost because it's cheaper to process there because they probably don't have the agro processing facilities in the global south. So it's about kitting out regions to be able to do their value addition, to be able to regionalize the food system as much as we can. But coffee, as an example, is a global commodity, which is a daily consumed thing globally, predominantly grows in the tropics, as well as cocoa. So those types of global commodities will always be traded. But how do we shorten supply chains around those essentials? Our grains, our vegetables, our fruits, our animals. Shorter the supply chain, the better for the animal, for the crops, for the nutrition. So I think that's really where the bioregional food system movement is going. It's just radical localization and then just trying to minimize the reliance on these long carbon heavy supply chains.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. I think there is a place for global trade. I think there's also an incredible opportunity to do it differently than we have historically. And I'm really curious, what would you say, or how can we better understand the value of each bioregion, or how can different bioregions like untap that potential or move closer to that?
Yeah, through localization of trade. I mean,
Mm,
there's like in the US's case, it's such a massive country that the states are almost like a country in Europe. So it's basically these supply chains that can be worked on regionally. So we understand what the population requirements are in that bioregion and kind of reverse engineer from there. It is quite a pivot from where we currently are, but if we understand the needs through data, we can reverse engineer from there. And I think that's what a lot of these big innovations around decentralized data collection at a bioregional level, um, understanding what the consumer needs are, and then matching that on a production level. That's where we're going to be able to find that very happy marriage between needs and production. And that's where data, and specifically application of AI in the redesign of these supply chains, is a very fascinating topic to dive into because the machine learning can really ramp up how we can engineer these supply chains to be radically localized. So yeah, I'm investigating that myself.
oh, that's fascinating, and such an exciting example, really, of ways that technology could be applied with a different intention and motivation. So yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that this is not a conversation about rejecting technology, rejecting innovation. Quite the opposite, really. It's working with that, but in alignment with nature's processes and all these principles that you shared with us. Um, So I could just keep asking you questions for a lot longer, but I'd like to I'd like to open up the floor to those of you who are joining us today to see if anyone would like to share a question or reflection. You know, knowing we have Matt here with us, he truly is such a wealth of experience and knowledge. So if anyone has something specific that they'd like to ask, yeah, please raise your hand or add your question in the chat. If not, I have many more questions I could keep asking, but I don't want to take up all the space. No, no
Maybe
one?
shoot me one more, Alana.
Even two.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about understanding people's needs, I'm really curious, like there are so many different diets that people follow around the world and so much controversy around what we need as humans to thrive. Um, how do you, I mean, there's like the globalization element in that too. It's like we have very different diets in different parts of the world and we think we need different things to thrive. How do you, from your perspective, how do we approach better understanding what we need to survive, coming from such a like calorie focused approach of what we need as opposed to a nutrient dense one?
I wish I had a little bit more knowledge around nutrition, but I think in essence, Alana, the culture around food is the most important thing to honor here because different cultures eat different things, and they are generally produced in region or have been in historically. But because of this mass globalization of the food system and these, like you walk down the average retail store and you look left and right, and you've got highly processed goods on either side of the aisle. And if they're not necessarily highly processed, is it good for you? You know, you look at the highly processed meats, the grains, the cereals, the tin foods, the candy, all of that stuff. I mean, we can see what's happening to the global population health-wise. Obesity is a massive issue globally. And it's just really dialing it back to what our grandmothers used to eat because we've literally lost that knowledge in two generations about what our grandparents used to eat and how they used to farm it themselves. And you can go back to the example of the organic victory garden post World War II and how healthy everyone looked in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And what is the main difference? We didn't have access to massive takeaway chain stores and ultra processed foods. And so, like, really dialing it back to the basics. What did our grandmothers eat? How did they plant it? Um, you know, and we all have different tastes.
Mhm.
Some cultures like a sweeter palate, some like more bitter palates. So it really does vary from country to country, from culture to culture. And really making that the centerpiece of how we evolve our food systems going forward, I really believe is, from my perspective anyway, where we need to go.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, as you said, it just trying to use my common sense. I agree with you. And like we don't need to reinvent the wheel around what different people need in different bioregions, but really looking at that historical understanding and eating pattern that different communities had when there was a more regionalized food system has a lot to teach us in how we could potentially move forward or design this more regionalized food webs in different places. So I see that there are some questions in the chat now. Maybe I just needed to give people a little bit to share. Okay, so the first question by Amy Allen. What can be done to clean our soil and make it sustainable with so much ground pollution?
Big question. So, I mean, there's many different types of crops that can be planted to help bioremediate soils. There's a massive global uptick around hemp, which, as we know, is such a wonder crop for many reasons, you know, from textiles to fiber to soil remediation to carbon sequestration. And how do we actually start looking at these catalytic crops and bringing them back into the production of our food systems for not only output purpose sake, you know? So, I mean, from a hemp perspective, we're not growing it because we just need the fiber, but we understand its application in an ecosystem.
Mm,
Really looking at the ecosystem approach at a farm level, I think would naturally clean up our soil, and it would help if we stop spraying glyphosate everywhere, just to call a spade a spade, and the damage that it does to the microlife in the soil. Yeah, some good points to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So really thinking of that, like diversifying the crops and potentially incorporating specific crops that are known to really enhance the cleaning up of our soil and making it more rich each time as opposed to um
Yeah, there's a nice one there about using wild or semi-cultivated edible wild plants, you know, and I think this is also a really big part of Indigenous knowledge, where a lot of these perceived weeds are actually highly nutritious for us and used to form part of our diets, especially when we used to be more foraging as a species, where we went out and foraged the food from the natural environment. And then that's also a diverse way to get the nutrients and the minerals that are often lacking in modern day food systems. I mean, if you start looking at the comparison of fruit in the 70s, the nutritional value of fruit then versus now, you would need to eat, you know, 10 to 12 apples to get the nutritional value out of one. And similarly, so for these wild and forage plants, there's just a huge amount of nutritional value, and we're losing that knowledge. So, yeah, like what did we used to eat? Where did we harvest it? And how can we preserve it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think wild plants are such an incredible example of that practice that is being lost in sometimes, and it really touches on so many of those principles you shared with us. Like there's the food access component, the foraging that you mentioned here too, the nutrient perspective, diversifying the crops. Yeah, it's just that diversity all around seems to be seem to be a really important piece of it. Um, there's this question here from Philip. Uh, Matt, what are your thoughts about precision fermentation?
Well, it's a great one, you know, because with the invention of the fridge, we don't often ferment our foods anymore, but have really been a cornerstone to our gut health. You know, many of these types of fermented foods, from the kimchis to the sauerkrauts to pickled beetroots or whatever we're growing, you know, it's just a really old school but very incredibly important thing for us to bring back is how do we ferment? You know, and I think that is one of the cornerstones about even how our grandmothers did it. I remember walking into a pantry where I just saw, you know, honey harvested from the hives, kraut made from the cabbages in winter, you know, and the beetroots made from the spring haul. And like, how do we actually bring that back? You know, I think that the fridge has kind of made convenience buying very easy, but really taking that thought around production planning and what do we want to be able to eat in the off season if we don't want to support these long carbon heavy supply chains. So great question, Philip. Thanks.
Mm. Well, knowing that we are at time, yeah, just so much gratitude, Matt, for joining us in today's conversation and expanding our view on regenerative agriculture and the importance of it incorporating some of these principles that you shared with us, such as social justice, that cultural piece, diversity, access as well. And yeah, and for so beautifully weaving together the three pillars of our work at Farmers Footprint, which are agriculture, health, and that cultural piece that you emphasized on.
Yeah, just much gratitude for having me on today. Alana and Farmers Footprint team, really enjoyed it. So just thank you to you and everyone who attended online. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks everyone who joined us. Quick shout out to Alan Reitz that I see here, who we had the pleasure of meeting at the Nutrient Density Conference. Brian, Amy, thank you for your questions. Yeah, and thank you so much, all of you, for staying with us the whole hour. We'll see you very soon for yet another Farm Yarns conversation. And thank you so much to the team for making this possible as well. Mel, Sophie, I see you're still there making it all happen. So yeah, so much gratitude, and we'll be in touch. Have a great rest of your Wednesday wherever you are in the world.
Thanks, everyone.